He built an empire, paid for his seat, and still got bumped. Not because of a glitch, but because of what he looked like. You ever have a moment that feels small at first, but then changes everything? Darius Ellison had one of those moments in the most unexpected place, Gate 42 at Sacramento International Airport. It was a Thursday afternoon. The air outside was warm, dry, California spring weather that made you think about iced coffee and short sleeves. Inside the terminal, though, it was all airport noise, the kind you learn to ignore after years of business travel. Announcements bouncing off the walls, wheels rolling over tile, someone yelling at TSA. Darius stood near the gate, dressed simply but sharp. Navy blazer, jeans, low-key black sneakers. He wasn't trying to stand out. He never did. His presence just carried. A few people stared, probably recognizing him, not from tabloids or TV, but from panels, podcasts, or business news. He'd built Nova Technologies from a rented co-working space in Oakland into one of the fastest-growing AI firms in the country, quietly, strategically, all without bending to anyone's idea of what a tech CEO should look like. He checked his phone, boarding in 10. His assistant had sent the itinerary earlier, seat 1A, first class, right where he needed to be. He had a speech to give in Phoenix, a big one. Fortune 500 execs, potential investors, journalists, all in one room. This was his arena now. When boarding started, he was in Group 1, naturally. He walked on, gave a polite nod to the flight attendant at the door, and made his way to the very first seat. Seat 1A, window seat, extra legroom, peace. He put his carry-on in the overhead, sat down, pulled out his notebook. He always jotted ideas down before speaking events. He liked quiet before the storm, but the quiet didn't last. "Excuse me, sir?" A soft voice cut through, a flight attendant. White, maybe mid-30s, blonde hair pulled tight into a bun. She gave him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "There's been a bit of a mix-up with the seating," she said. Darius looked up, polite but confused. "This is my seat, 1A. She paused. "Yes, I see that, but we're going to need you to move to another seat for this flight. Just a small reassignment." "Why?" he asked calmly. The smile faltered. "We had a last-minute passenger upgrade that caused a scheduling issue." Now a second flight attendant joined, this one taller, male, maybe in his 40s, also white, wearing that same awkward smile. "We apologize for the inconvenience. It's just a quick move to seat 12C. Still an aisle seat." Darius held up his boarding pass. "This was purchased weeks ago." The male attendant's face hardened, just slightly. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to ask you to deplane." That word, deplane. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't making a scene. He was just sitting in a seat he paid for. But somehow, he was the problem. Other passengers started to watch, eyes peeked over headrests, a few furrowed brows, but no one said a word. Then the real kicker, they brought in the last-minute upgrade. A young white man, maybe late 20s, wearing khakis and a Patagonia vest, sipping on a smoothie like he owned the sky. The crew smiled at him like he was royalty. "Right this way, Mr. Tanner?" Darius didn't argue. He looked at them both, then nodded once, slowly. He picked up his notebook, grabbed his bag, and walked back to seat 12C, coach. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes was enough. But what neither flight attendant noticed was the woman 2 rows behind, holding her phone just low enough to not be seen, already hitting record. Michelle Tanaka wasn't supposed to be on that flight. Her original connection from Seattle had been delayed by a weather issue in Reno, and she'd been rerouted through Sacramento at the last minute. Row 3A wasn't her usual spot, but she wasn't complaining. Legroom, early boarding, and a chance to catch up on emails before hitting Phoenix for the conference. Michelle had been following Darius Ellison's journey for years. As a senior producer for the Ledger Report, one of the more respected business news programs on cable, she'd covered CEOs, policymakers, and tech billionaires. But Darius always stood out, never loud, never messy, never desperate for the spotlight. Just sharp, focused, intentional. When he walked onto the plane, she spotted him instantly. Quiet as always, clean cut, dressed for business, but not for show. She watched as he took seat 1A, front row. So when the flight attendants showed up, back to back, and started giving him that "we need you to move" line, her body tensed. She'd seen this kind of thing before. Not often, but enough to know what was coming. She unlocked her phone, angled it low, tapped the record button. No one noticed. Everyone was too busy pretending not to watch. Except her. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. Just a quick reassignment. If you don't comply... And then that guy, smoothie in hand, like this was a rideshare instead of a plane. She didn't recognize him, but it didn't matter. The way the crew welcomed him made everything obvious. Privilege didn't need an introduction. Michelle kept recording, heart thudding. She wasn't sure why at first. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was outrage. Maybe it was the way Darius looked down for half a second when they gave his seat away, as if he was used to this kind of moment. Just not today. She zoomed in slightly, catching the way he lifted his bag and walked down the aisle. No fuss, no words, but power in every step. The flight took off on time. Nobody talked much. A few glanced over at row 12C, probably wondering if that was really him. Some already knew. Michelle kept her phone tucked in her lap. She reviewed the video once, clean, steady, clear audio. Then she opened Twitter. Her fingers hovered. She didn't want this to feel like a gotcha moment, but she also wasn't about to let it slide. She typed, "This is Darius Ellison, CEO of one of the fastest growing tech companies in America. Just got removed from his first-class seat to make room for someone else. Calm, dignified, and disrespected. Watch this." Then she uploaded the video. No hashtags, not yet. She clicked send. Then she closed her phone, leaned her head back, and looked out the window. But back in seat 12C, Darius sat motionless, unaware that his quiet response had already become the loudest voice on the plane. Row 12 wasn't built for comfort. It was built for survival. Darius folded his long legs as best he could, his knees brushing the seat in front of him. The overhead bin above was already full, so he had to keep his bag at his feet. It was cramped, hot, and the man beside him had taken the armrest and claimed it like real estate. Still, he sat there, silent, still. He pulled out his notebook again and opened to the same page he'd been staring at before. The words were blurred now, not from emotion, but from focus. He didn't allow moments like this to shake him, at least not on the outside. The man beside him gave a small double take, then muttered, "Hey, aren't you..." Darius gave a small nod, but didn't add to it. "Oh, man, thought so," the guy said, shifting in his seat. "Love your stuff. You on this flight to speak at the AI summit?" "Yeah," Darius said simply. The man looked confused. "They got you back here in coach?" Darius didn't answer. He didn't owe anyone a story. 10 rows ahead, the guy in his seat was already reclining, sipping another smoothie, scrolling through his phone like he had no clue, or worse, didn't care. Darius let his head lean back slightly. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. He thought about his father, an electrician from Stockton, taught him the importance of showing up early, staying quiet, and working harder than the guy next to you. He never once boarded a plane, but he used to tell Darius, "Don't get too comfortable in any seat. Comfort makes you forget your value." The voice echoed in his head now. He wasn't angry, not yet. He wasn't hurt either. He was tired. Tired of the way people could erase you with a smile. Tired of the calculations they made about who belonged where. He knew the game. He'd played it for decades. But every now and then, it caught him off guard. The seat wasn't the problem. It was the assumption. He belonged there, but someone decided he didn't. Just like that. The flight attendant from earlier walked past him on her way down the aisle. She didn't look his way, not once. Just like she hadn't looked him in the eyes when she told him to move. Respect wasn't something she thought he was owed. Not in that seat. Not with that skin. The man next to him was still stealing glances. "Crazy, right?" he said, almost whispering. "Like, they bumped you? Man, I've flown this airline for 10 years. I've never seen them just move someone like that." Darius nodded again. First time for everything. A few rows ahead, Michelle opened her laptop. She was typing now. Notes, quotes. She was building something. Darius didn't know that yet. He still didn't know she'd posted the video. Still didn't know it was climbing views by the second. He glanced out the window. The clouds rolled by beneath them like slow waves. He opened his notebook again and started to write. One line at the top of a fresh page. "They can move your seat, but they can't move your name." But 35,000 feet in the air, the internet was already catching fire, and his name was right at the center of it. By the time the wheels hit the tarmac in Phoenix, Darius was already moving. He grabbed his bag, nodded a silent goodbye to the man beside him, and filed out with the rest of the coach passengers. No rush, no scene. That wasn't his style. He didn't check his phone right away. Too many notifications cluttered the lock screen. He figured it was the usual: calendar alerts, last-minute tweaks to his keynote slides, maybe a message from his assistant confirming his car service. He didn't think much of it until he reached baggage claim. That's when things started to shift. First, it was a younger man, early 30s maybe, standing near Carousel 5. He glanced up from his phone, looked directly at Darius, then did a slow double take. Not the kind of stare you give a celebrity. This one had weight, recognition mixed with discomfort. Then another. A woman in a dark blazer, earbuds in, staring at her phone, then at Darius, then back to her phone. She didn't say anything, just shook her head like she couldn't believe it. Darius finally pulled out his phone. The notifications weren't normal. He had over 300 unread texts. His email inbox was climbing. Twitter, X, had completely imploded. One hashtag after another. Hashtag first class. While black, Darius Ellison, Nova. Unbothered, reclaim. He opened the video. It started right where he expected, his voice steady, the words from the flight attendant. The look in his eyes as he stood, picked up his bag, and walked away from the seat. The comments underneath were relentless. This man handled disrespect with more class than I could ever muster. They really kicked out Darius Ellison? Are you serious? Name the airline. We're done pretending. He paid for it, he earned it, and they still didn't see him. Darius stared at the screen for a few seconds, still calm, still unreadable. But something behind his eyes shifted. He wasn't angry. He was focused now. His phone rang, caller ID, Camille Dorsey, his head of PR. "Don't say anything," she said the moment he picked up. "Don't tweet. Don't post. Don't blink. Let it breathe." "Wasn't planning to," Darius replied. "You're trending across 3 platforms. Major networks are already requesting statements. Some exec at the airline is trying to get ahead of it. Damage control mode." "I didn't ask for anything," he said. "I know," Camille replied. "That's why it's hitting even harder. You didn't ask. You didn't push. You just stood there and let them show who they were." He paused. "How long before it dies down?" She hesitated. "That depends. You want it to?" Darius looked up. The driver was holding a sign with his name on it, oblivious to the internet storm unfolding. The conference was still hours away, his keynote still waiting. But the world had already heard from him, and he hadn't even opened his mouth. But in one quiet corner of an airline boardroom, people were panicking, and this time, he wouldn't be the one moved. The clip hit 2 million views before Darius even walked on stage. He stood backstage at the Arizona Grand Conference Center, just off the main ballroom where the Fortune 500 summit was in full swing. Rows of corporate decision-makers, tech influencers, investors, and analysts sat with coffee cups and branded notebooks, waiting to hear from one of the most respected minds in AI. The MC introduced him like nothing had happened. No mention of the flight, no mention of the trending hashtags, just the usual accolades. But when Darius walked out, the applause had a different energy to it, less corporate, more personal. Like they weren't just clapping for his title, they were clapping because they saw him now. Not the algorithm genius, not the founder. The man who didn't flinch when he was disrespected. He took the mic, adjusted it once, and paused. He scanned the room. They were ready for a speech about machine learning, future trends, big data. But he wasn't ready to give that. Not yet. He cleared his throat. "Before I talk about innovation," he said slowly, "let's talk about perception." Silence. You can build a company. You can hire a brilliant team. You can lead with integrity. You can invest in the future. But sometimes, to some people, you're still not supposed to be in seat 1A. The room was still. Some nodded. A few leaned forward, eyes locked in. "I didn't say anything on that flight," he continued, "not because I was afraid, but because I knew who I was. I didn't need to raise my voice to make a point. And thanks to the woman sitting a few rows behind me, the whole world saw it too. Backstage, Michelle stood watching. She hadn't expected him to bring her up. She didn't even know if he knew it was her who filmed it. But he did. She knew it mattered, he said, because when people pretend not to see you, the only real response is to make sure they can't look away. The applause this time hit differently. Not the usual polite kind, it carried weight. Darius moved into his actual keynote after that, weaving in AI ethics, bias in data sets, and the importance of building systems that reflect the world as it is, not just as it's been designed to serve certain people. But even as he spoke, outside those conference walls, everything was moving fast. The airline had issued a statement, generic, predictable. We regret the inconvenience, seating error, reviewing our internal procedures. The kind of statement that gets copy-pasted 100 times a year, but it didn't work this time. Because just hours later, someone leaked internal emails showing the upgraded passenger was Logan Tripp, the nephew of a regional vice president at the airline. The upgrade wasn't random, it was an order. Then someone leaked the employee chat logs from the gate crew. One message read, "That guy in 1A doesn't look like a Darius. Might be a check needed." The screenshots exploded online. Now, it wasn't just a story, it was a scandal. That night, Darius's team issued a brief statement, just one sentence. Nova Technologies will no longer fly with or partner with any organization that does not recognize our humanity. And that was it. But behind the airline's corporate walls, panic turned into fallout, and the clock on accountability had officially started. The airline tried to play it smart. Internal memo, PR, huddle, legal review, the usual checklist when someone gets caught being themselves on camera. They pulled the 2 flight attendants off the schedule, pending investigation. They emailed a statement to the media calling it a training oversight. They even reached out to Darius's assistant privately, offering a refund, some extra miles, and a direct line to their executive customer relations team. But Nova didn't bite. Darius never replied. He didn't need to. By the next morning, 5 major clients had announced they were reevaluating their partnerships with the airline. Not out of sudden morality, but because their own customers were demanding it. Tech forums, business blogs, TikToks, podcasts. They all had the clip. They all had the story. Then came the leaks. An anonymous employee dumped a full chain of internal emails onto a public thread. One of the emails included a name, Seth Broman, the airline's VP of Customer Experience. He was the one who authorized the override. The email said, "Let's bump whoever's in 1A for Logan. No noise. Make it clean. No noise. Make it clean." Turns out they'd done it before. Often, quietly, with no one filming. This time, though, different world, different name, different target. Under pressure, the airline announced that the 2 flight attendants had been terminated. The gate agent who flagged Darius's ticket, fired, and the VP, resigned, effective immediately. But the public wasn't interested in corporate chess moves. They wanted a face. They wanted accountability. They wanted to know how someone like Darius could be dismissed so easily, and what that said about everyone else who didn't have 1 million followers or a company behind their name. Michelle Tanaka finally spoke publicly, not for clout, not for attention, just facts. "I filmed what I saw because I knew what it was," she said in a live interview. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a message. Subtle, polite, dangerous." She paused before finishing. And he knew it too. That's why he didn't argue. Because sometimes, when you've seen it enough times, you know exactly how it ends. That clip went viral too. Darius remained quiet. He still hadn't made a single personal statement. No tweets, no interviews, not even a quote. But that silence wasn't weakness. It was strength. Back at the Nova office in San Jose, his staff kept working. Product deadlines didn't stop. Meetings continued. But something had changed. People walked taller, clients listened closer. Investors backed off with their usual suggestions. Respect moved through the building like oxygen. And at a school in Oakland, where Darius had recently funded a robotics program for middle schoolers, a 6th grader stood up during class and said, "If they don't want you in the front, build your own plane." The teacher posted it. The clip took off. But in every corner of corporate America, quiet conversations had already begun. About power, about perception, and about what happens when the wrong person gets disrespected on the wrong day. A week passed. No lawsuit, no press conference, no tell-all podcast, just silence. the kind that makes the right people nervous. Darius kept moving. Meetings, deadlines, a new round of hires, a new grant for underrepresented founders in tech. The world saw the video, sure, but the world didn't see what came next, because Darius didn't need to show them. He already knew who he was. The interview request came quietly, from 60 Minutes. A producer reached out to Camille, his PR lead, not because they needed drama, but because they'd been watching for a long time. They saw the story before the plane. They just hadn't had a reason to call. Until now. Camille asked him twice, "You sure you want to do this?" Darius looked at her. "If we're gonna talk, we talk for real." The segment aired on a Sunday night. Black backdrop, simple lighting, no music, just Darius, a camera, and a country still talking about a seat on a plane. The host asked him what everyone had been thinking. "You were wronged, you were silent, you let the internet speak for you, why?" Darius leaned forward just slightly. "Because I know what happens when you push back. I've seen it my whole life. A raised voice becomes a threat. A firm tone becomes aggression. So I didn't give them the story they wanted." He paused. "I gave them the story they created, and let everyone else decide what to do with it." The host nodded quietly. "And what would you say to the people who made that decision? Who took that seat from you?" Darius looked right into the lens. "I'd say, thank you. You reminded people that progress doesn't mean immunity, that no matter how far we climb, there's still work to do. You helped prove my point better than I ever could have." He smiled, barely. "And you reminded me that power doesn't come from a seat. It comes from who you are when you get moved." That line echoed through living rooms, offices, classrooms. The video of the interview spread just like the first one, except this time, it wasn't outrage, it was reflection. And somewhere, a young black kid sitting in the back seat of his mom's car saw the clip on her phone and whispered, "He looks like me." That's what mattered. That's what stuck. Back at Nova HQ, someone printed the quote from the interview and taped it to the break room wall. "Power doesn't come from a seat. It comes from who you are when you get moved." Nobody said who put it there. Nobody needed to. Sometimes, the loudest message isn't screamed. It's the one you feel when everything else goes quiet. And if you take anything from this story, let it be this. You don't have to fight every battle to win the war. Just know who you are, stand firm, and let the world adjust. Because silence, when rooted in purpose, can move mountains. If this story meant something to you, share it. Speak up when it matters, and never let anyone tell you where you don't belong.